Today's hearing is about the U.S. financial system, and this financial system proved to be remarkably resilient during COVID. But I am concerned about increasing pressure on banks to embrace wokeism and appease the far left's attacks on capitalism. And I worry that continuing down this path could lead to distorted credit allocation, activists seeking to make political change through the financial system instead of through the democratic process, and ultimately diminish prosperity for Americans. So first, let's observe that the banking system did in fact prove to be very resilient. Last year, we had the worst pandemic in more than 100 years. The government shut down almost the entire economy. We had the most severe recession since the Great Depression. And despite all that, banks remained stable, responded to their customers' needs for credit because they were so well capitalized, they were able to do so. In fact, one of the best decisions we made during COVID probably was administering the Paycheck Protection Program through the banking system because there was no other system that had the scale or agility to run this program. And banks leveraged their relationships to deliver hundreds of billions of PPP dollars to millions of small businesses so they could keep their workers employed. So the financial system's contributions to America's economic growth before and during the pandemic are really part of the larger success story of our capitalist system. There's no economic system has lifted more people out of poverty, created more opportunity, and produced a higher standard of living than democratic capitalism. Thanks to capitalism, life is better for the vast majority of Americans today than it's ever been. In fact, just before COVID, we had the best economy of my lifetime, as measured by the very metrics that my Democratic colleagues believe are very important. I mean, we had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years for all Americans. We had all-time record low unemployment rates for African Americans, Hispanics. We had more jobs than people looking for work, and we had a record low poverty rate. And contrary to the characterizations we sometimes see, we had across-the-board wage growth, and the wage growth was growing fastest for the lowest income earners, so we were narrowing the income gap. In fact, the very system of economic freedom that my colleagues sometimes criticize was actually creating unprecedented and shared prosperity across America. That's why I'm surprised and troubled to see some leaders of some banks taking actions that I think undermine the property rights that are at the very heart of our system and can lead to politicized lending. Some bank leaders have embraced the so-called stakeholder capitalism, which really diminishes the primacy of shareholders in our economy and encourages corporations to pursue a social agenda rather than prioritize its responsibility to its owners. It's a fact that a well-run business always benefits their stakeholders. That's the nature of business. But management's responsibility is to do so in service to shareholders because they own the company. And people who own a company, whether it's through shares in a retirement account, pension plan, college savings account, or anything else, they rely on a firm's officers to look out for their financial interests. Making decisions based on social policy objectives rather than profit maximization deprives these shareholders of their rightful property. And worse yet, once shareholders' rights are reduced to the level of all other stakeholders, how does a company's management decide whose interest to prioritize? Now, some believe the government should step in and make those decisions. For example, there are people who favor a prohibition on stock buybacks. After all, if the shareholders' interest is no longer paramount, then the government can determine that capital would be more appropriately allocated to employees or the environment or some other special interest group. And it's a fallacy to think that if you're seeking profits, you're not serving people. In fact, it's the exact opposite. A business can only profit when it satisfies its customers, and that can only be achieved with a satisfied workforce and good relationships with its community. Finally, let me close with just a suggested word of unsolicited advice. If there's an issue in the political realm that affects your bank, like taxes or regulatory policy, I would hope you would articulate your views on behalf of your shareholders. But if there's a highly charged social or political issue that involves balancing competing values, such as balancing access to voting with election security, both of which are important, sometimes competing values, that ought to be left to elected lawmakers. Those are the folks who are elected to make these difficult policy decisions, and most importantly, they're the people who are directly accountable to the American people who hire and fire them, the voters in their jurisdictions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.